Today we're going to be looking at sculpting in Blender, and that is shaping using the sculpting tools rather than making sculpts. To be honest, making sculpts these days, I mean we're in mid 2018, it's pretty much a waste of time. It's a very inefficient way of using geometry these days since Mesh came along. But anyway, sculpting. So what is sculpting? Well, basically sculpting is like a digital clay modeling, and we have tools to shape the geometry and form it how we like it. The easiest way to start practicing with sculpting, I guess, is to add a mesh, and I'm going to add a plane. Okay. Just like a modifier, we need enough geometry on the plane. We've only one face at the minute to be able to form it and shape it how we want. So I'm going to subdivide a few times. So let's do 10. Let's do another 10. That's fine. Okay, and I'm gonna scale this up a bit, just so we've got something to look at. Right, if we tab into sculpt mode, we get a complete new set of operators here, and we'll go through this and kind of learn what each does. And we've also got a whole load of sculpting tools here. Some add, some subtract. We've got this at creases. We can flatten. We can kind of grab and pull, inflate, smooth. We'll go through them. Okay. Now, the default tool, it seems default to this sculpt draw, which, you know, kind of raises the geometry. So, you know, if I was to... Okay, you see how this is forming. And if I go back into edit mode here, you can see how the geometry has been pulled into shape following the shape of that brush. Let me control Z backwards. Alright. But often it is easier to see what you're sculpting when you're using a matte cap. Now if, like me, your matte cap option is missing, you're probably not in solid view. Okay, now we see this matte cap has appeared. And for matte caps, you can use any of these, but these clay type of materials seem to work well. The other one I do use is kind of like the gold, and sometimes I will swap between a couple, but using the matte cap does make what you're doing a lot easier to see. So now if I was to I'm in object mode, let me tab into sculpt mode. You can see how that looks kind of a lot clearer than that does. Okay, right, so let's go through some options here. I'll work top to bottom, but before I do, the first thing I'm going to look at is the symmetry, because you notice as I'm sculpting here, it was sculpting on both sides of this plane. Okay, that's because this symmetry lock is on the X. Now, you can lock it on a different or 2 or 3 axis. But let's say now I do this on the Y. You notice the symmetry is top to bottom as I'm looking at it now, rather than the left to right with the X. So if you're doing anatomy or an awful lot of things, anything symmetrical, it's a good idea to have this symmetry lock on. Alright. The other thing I do, generally speaking, is if I go into object mode, I will make everything with smooth shading, which makes this a lot, well, it smooths it out basically. So when we're doing kind of organic stuff, this works a lot better. Smooth shading, we can see how we're going to look. So let me control Z back a couple of times, and what I'm actually going to do is in object mode, I'm going to just duplicate this so I've got a copy that I can just delete this and bring in a fresh sheet, as it were. But we're going to be working on just this. Alright, so let's go into sculpt mode. So we'll start off with the default brush, which is the sculpt draw brush. Okay, it's actually a texture, and later on we'll be looking at importing textures to use as our own custom sculpt brushes. But all of these are actually a texture that Blender reacts with. But what we've got here is we've got a couple of settings. The first is the radius, so if we look at the size of the red circle surrounding my cursor there, if I increase the radius, you can obviously see the circle is bigger, and obviously the bigger the radius, the more influence it has on the object. Okay, let's control Z back, so let's bring that back down. Strength, well, let's try it at, say, quarter strength, 0.25, somewhere around there. Okay, so if I draw one line down here, you can see kind of that strength there. If I increase the strength to 1 and I draw another line down here, you see it's having a lot more pull, a lot more effect. Try and get this to an angle where you can see it. But yeah, you can see the idea. This is pulled a lot more. This has had a lot more influence than the lower strength. Alright. Let's put strength about 0.5. Auto smooth. Okay, so we've got this here. If we turn auto smooth up to 1, once again trying to find an angle where you see what it does basically is it smooths the pen stroke out a bit more. What we got here? Area plane, the sculpt plane. Right, how to explain this? If I was to make this on a Y plane and sculpt, we're getting no kind of no influence here. So let me just duplicate this, Shift D, let's bring it up a bit, and let's rotate it on the Y by 90. Okay, and now if I sculpt on this, let's go into sculpt mode again, it should, and it is influencing this Y plane object, but it's only pulling along the Y axis, and on the object that is on the Z or the Z plane it's having no influence. Probably because that wasn't selected, so let's select that now. Right, it does. It only pulls along the Y axis, this Y plane. So if I try to pull it this way, we get nothing. If I change this to the X plane, you can see where it's having an influence. Alright, and obviously if I do I need to select this object, go into sculpt mode. If I change this to the Z or the Z plane, it should have no influence. It is having an influence on the Y. It should have more on the Z. Okay, not too sure about that. Never used it, to be honest with you. I was just trying to go through it. But yeah, you can see how it's constraining to a particular plane. So let's delete these objects again. Let's make a copy of this. Right. Let's go back into sculpt mode. Alright, so I'm going to reset this back to the area plane, which was the default. Let's turn our auto smooth down to nothing, and strength. Okay, front faces only. That'll be when you've got a manifold object, an object with volume. As you sculpt on top, it will sculpt kind of on the back unless you use the front faces only. Right, we've got add and subtract here, so let me just turn off this mirror, this symmetry. So As I'm left clicking and dragging down, we are pulling up the geometry. If I change this to subtract and left clicking and pulling down, we're actually pushing the geometry away from us rather than pulling it towards us. Okay, now although this function is here, the way to do this, let's Control Z backwards, is so let's pull this one here, which is pulling up. If I use Control and click and drag, it has the same effect between add and subtract. Okay. Right, so basically I ignore this and I just use Control to control which direction I'm sculpting in. Let's go back a couple of steps. So we've got this kind of flat plane again. Just checking that's all flat. Let's go into sculpt mode. Alright. Texture is where we can add a new sculpt brush texture. We'll come to that later on, along with the mapping and what have you. We'll ignore that for the minute. Stroke method. Okay. Right. There's a couple of options here, depending what you want to do. The default is space. Okay, so as we draw a line here, it's just pulling across fairly smoothly. You can play around with these, but for example, if I change this to dots, and I started we're seeing a lot of a different influence there. Let's turn this back to what was it, on space, and I do another. We're not getting the same kind of influence. Okay, much less influence. Alright, so we'll leave that on space. Spacing and jitter. Okay, spacing was defaulted at 10. So say I brought this right the way up. Maybe too far. Let's bring this up to, I don't know, 80. You can see how instead of the continuous line, it's putting a space between them. Okay, so it looked like it defaulted at 10. Let me Control Z back. Let's change that to 10. Okay, so let me draw or bring a line across here. And if I bring this down to 1, what'll happen? It should be looking a lot smoother, but it's very hard to see here. Maybe see it better in edit mode? Not really. But probably the 10 and 1 are so close together that we wouldn't see it. But certainly when we bring it up 200%, you can see how it's really spacing the influences further apart. Alright, let's bring this back down to about 10. Jitter will be how far the sculpt brush goes off the center line of the cursor. So at 0 it'll be follow the cursor exactly. Jitter should add some randomness. You can see that? Okay. Right. Curve. Let's Control Z a couple of times. Much like with the proportional edit tool, we've got the same kind of curve presets, or we can add our own presets. Let me try something. Let me just pull a line down off the end of the, and if we zoom in on this, might be kind of hard to visualize, but this fall off matches this curve. This curve would be mirrored. so it'd be like a bell curve, which it is. It comes up, falls up, and back down again. This is only half the curve. Whereas if we did it with, say, a flat curve, let's try this here. You can see, although that's a bit lumpy, you can see instead of that smooth on it fall off, we're getting more of this kind of square flattened thing. Let's try it with this kind of curve, which should give us a sharp peak in the middle. Looking very similar to that, but basically it's that kind of fall off. So we'll just come back to this. Right, okay, I'm going to leave this geometry on here for a minute, because the next thing I want to talk about is Dino Topo. Okay, what Dino Topo will do is it will add geometry to your base mesh. So if I was to start pulling some of this up, okay, now if I go into edit mode, instead of these nice flat planes, that's actually the Dino Topo's turned everything into triangles, but you can see the quads that are there. It's adding more geometry, and we can see this here where it's added it, because we're getting a lot of these random triangles that are not selected when we go into edit, because they are the new ones are not selected. It's only selecting the existing, the old ones. Okay, so we're adding geometry with Dino Topo, so that's something to be aware of. I wouldn't say be careful of, because sculpting is not really a method I would recommend for direct upload to Second Life. Because the geometry gets very pushed, pulled, stretched, you know, and with Dino Topo it adds geometry. What sculpting is good for is for making a shape for retopology, for retopology, pretty much like we did Jim. So you can make a fabulously detailed sculpt. The geometry will look awful, but then when you retopo it, you're getting a decent geometry for use as a game asset. And much like we did Jim, you know, if you were to texture your sculpt and bake it or put materials on it, you can transfer those across with the same kind of methods. Right, let's Control Z this back to somewhere flat. Well, I lost that. That's alright. Shift D, let's pull another one across. G. Sorry, just getting this down on the grid somewhat. There we go. Alright, let's go back into Sculpt again. So we've looked at the Dino Topo. Turn up, we looked at the curve. We looked at the symmetry. And those are kind of really the basics of the tools. Let's put this back onto area plane. Anything else to say here at the minute? No. Okay. Let's have a look at some of these different tools that do different things. So like I said, the default is Sculpt Draw. Now there are keyboard shortcuts for all of these. I'll try and find them for you. I never remember them. There's so many of them. So I just tend to, when I'm sculpting, I just tend to come to the window to change. What we do also a lot is change the radius and the strength, but we can do that with keyboard shortcuts. So for example, the keyboard shortcut for the radius is F. So if I press F and drag, let me do this kind of over here, it might be easier to see. So if I press F and I drag, you can see my radius sliders moving up, okay? So I let go of the mouse, which gives me this large area. I can bring it back in to concentrate. Okay, so I've got this large radius. Obviously it depends how close I am to my sculpt, so I can bring this in. I could control that, bring it the other way, and start to make geometry like that. The strength is a Shift and F. So we're looking at strength here. We've got a strength of about 0.5. So by Shift F, you'll see inside these circles we've got a number, and you can see the strengths going up and down. So Shift and F is a quick keyboard shortcut for changing the strength. So we're at 0.5. Let's bring this down to about 0.1. Okay. Now when I try and sculpt, it is having an influence. It's control. Okay, but a lot less of an influence. Control F, let's bring this up. Was it Control F? Shift F. Shift F, I'm sorry. Bring the strength up about 0.7 thereabouts. Okay. There we go. Silly smiley face. So let's have a look. We've got the ice cream man outside apparently. We've got the sculpt draw brush. Okay, we should do that. Let me turn this topo off. Not on topo, the symmetry. We've got blobs, which will kind of might be easier to see that if I do more spacing. Okay, too much spacing. Blobs is basically just adding, pretty much think of it like a clay sculpt. It's just adding more material on, more clay material onto it in blobs. Let's bring this back down to clay strips is one that I use quite a lot, which kind of builds up the shape, the form in strips. Now I know this is looking lumpy, okay, but we can kind of build up a rough shape, okay, and build it up a bit. But we can come in after with another tool such as the smooth tool and start to smooth that roughness out while still maintaining that volume. Okay, crease actually does produce a crease in the geometry. So let me pull a crease across here. You can see it's starting to cause that crease. It's a wide crease, but we can increase the pinch value, okay, and make it a much sharper kind of crease. And equally, we can decrease this and make it a much more kind of gradual, wider crease. Okay, bring this up to about 0.5 again. Let's Control Z backwards a couple of times. Yeah. Alright, let's delete this. This is why I made the extra object. Right. Let's go to sculpt mode again. Crease, fill, deepen. Best way to explain that with the crease, I suppose. So let's go back to a crease and let's create a sharp crease with a high pinch here. Okay, if we come across to the fill and deepen tool, it should kind of reduce the depth and fill this in a bit without kind of filling it all in at once. Let's try this in the gold. You can see how that's starting to shallow out. Then obviously after that we could go to kind of a smooth to smooth some of this out. Okay, that was fill deepen. Flatten. We'll kind of average out an area and flatten it out. Let's put this back into the clay, the red clay. Okay, grab. We'll basically start to grab and pull areas out. Inflate. We kind of had a look at. It's very similar to the sculpt draw brush, but it seems to work more. It builds on itself, whereas the sculpt draw doesn't. You'd have to like let go of the mouse and keep going over. The inflate keeps inflating it. Layer looks a lot like the clay strips. But it does seem to be flattening out there. Okay. It's going to take some getting used to some of this. Masking we'll come back to. That's where we can hide areas that we're going to sculpt on. Very good with things like faces. You know, if you're sculpting the nose and you don't want to go over on the lips, you can mask the lips and the eyes out and just work on the nose. Nudge will kind of pull. What is that? I think you can see that clear here where we see these banding lines. If I start to pull, it's nudging them over, it's pulling them across. Pinch mag. I've never used this one actually. Let's see what it's doing. Well, it's creating a very sharp seam there, isn't it? So we got that. If we kind of pinch magnify along this seam, it's really sharpening that edge up. You can see that? Okay. Rotate. So if we get this, you can see how it's rotating the geometry around the center of the brush. Scrape. So we start to scrape some of this out. Let's have a go at this sharp edge we created. And scrape is kind of leaving the volume, but just kind of scraping off that sharp edge there, that high peak, which you can kind of represent it here. Okay, sculpture we know, smooth we've had a look at briefly when we just kind of smooth all this roughness out. Snake hook, yes, be very careful with this one. That's why you need to be careful. If I go backwards, so the thing with snake hook is it works pretty well, works pretty much like the grab, but it is kind of directional, so if you're going in directions, you don't want to go too far off the direction, otherwise you get this long kind of pulling. It works well there, and we'll go on for quite a way, but once you start trying to create volume with it, it does kind of mess up a bit. What we got? Thumb is pretty much like nudge really, but it's in one direction, shall we say. So let's see that. Now if I was to go into edit mode here, look at the geometry of that. In fact, going into edit mode sometimes is a good way to see what's happening with the geometry. It's just basically kind of pulling the where our thumb print would be, you know, the geometry's kind of staying the way it was, but behind it where we're pulling, it's stretching enormously. Alright, that's the basics of all the tools. Yeah. Right. So we're at what, 29 minutes. Okay, we'll stop here, and when we come back we'll have a look at another project.